I have mentioned a few names in that sweeping review of about the first 100 years of Muslim history. And in that I mentioned a few movements, etc., that I'd like to cover in just a little more detail now. Understanding what they stood for, what were their theological points of views, what were their political points of views. We are approaching all these subjects, you have to understand, not from a theological point of view. We're approaching them purely from the point of view of looking at it as a historian, as a social scientist, as a political scientist. So while we may agree or disagree theologically with one or another point of view, it's very important for us to be able to understand what it stands for. Take, for example, the Kharijites. Now, in their case, the word itself means something really horrible for a lot of different people. Precisely because they are the people who assassinated Hazrat Ali radhiyallahu ta'ala anhu. And also because they considered the murder of Hazrat Usman to be legitimate, which again is something deeply upsetting to most of us. But we want to understand them, not for these particular reasons, but we want to understand their political ideas. They did play a very important, influential role in the shaping of history and Islamic history and the debates that were occurring at that time. So their main slogan used to be, "Judgment belongs to God alone." Judgment belongs to God alone, which of course is also there in the Holy Quran. But what they meant by this was not just that, of course, judgment always belongs to God alone, but what they meant by it was that those who were judging over us were usurping the role of God, and they had declared themselves to be Khalifas, and they had declared our destiny in different ways. And in fact, these are the people that we had to do war against. These are the people that the Prophet, peace be upon him, came to do war against. So they are the most determined enemies of the Umayyads. They continue to fight the Umayyads through armed war and armed struggle, in little bands that were continuously attacking their troops for at least 100 years. They continue to fight them, and they continue to fight even beyond that. The most implacable enemies of the Umayyads. They were of the view, as I've already said, that Hazrat Ali as well as Hazrat Usman radhiyallahu ta'ala anhu had both deviated from the path of Islam, which of course is the least popular view in the Muslim world today. But interestingly, their view of who could be the Imam, who could be the Khalifa, was that it could be anyone. Any Muslim, based purely on merit, could be the Khalifa. They didn't have to come from the house of Quraysh. They could, but they didn't have to. They didn't have to come from the Banu Umayyah. They could, but they didn't have to. They didn't have to come from the Hashemite or from the Ahl Bayt, etc. It could be any Muslim. It could be an Arab, and interestingly, it could even be a non-Arab. The non-Arabs were known as Ajmi, the Persians. It could even be the Persians. And so, for that reason, they are often referred to as being democratic, sometimes even referred to as being anarchists, etc. Hazrat Ali certainly considered them to be anarchists in the sense that they didn't want any kind of government. And remember, in Islamic political discourse, anarchism is not a good thing. Okay, it's not like the West where anarchism is so cool, man, no government, etc. No, anarchy is bloodshed and so on. Also, the balance of power was with the community. So even if they had an Imam, the Imam wasn't very particularly strong. The Imam could be easily replaced, etc. The Imam could even be killed if the Imam was deviating from the path, etc. There's no separation of power in the sense of political versus religious power. There's no separation in that sense. So in that sense, many of them are referred to as being democratic in a very tribalist sort of way. In a very tribal sort of way. They were originally based in Kufa, but then soon their main base of operations became Basra, which, as you know, is a southern Iraqi city. And the characteristic that they had, which is why they liked the Khariji thought or theology, was that they were mainly of nomadic origin. So where the nomads were more prevalent, that is where the Khariji idea was most strongly upheld. Why? Because the nomadic view of leadership was now replicated in the Khariji Islamic view of imamat. So they had several sects inside themselves as well who continued to fight. One of the most important sects is the Ibadiyya, and Omanis are today Ibadi Muslims. So although they say that we don't agree with the Khariji doctrines of that particular period, they are watered down now, etc. But they are the descendants, at least in terms of intellectual ideas, theocratic ideas of the Kharijis. So what were their beliefs? They believed that Hazrat Abu Bakr and Hazrat Umar Raziyallahu Ta'ala anhu had been true imams of guidance. They support them, they follow them. But Hazrat Usman and Ali had started as legitimate caliphs, but they had deviated. Thereafter, all caliphs, regardless, Umayyads, etc., all of them, Abbasids as well, all of them had been tyrants. They had been kings and they had been tyrants, they had set up Malukiyat. And the only Muslims who were left were the Kharijis themselves, and the only true imams were those imams that belonged to the Kharijis. And one had to separate themselves at first, they thought, from these kafirs who have chosen to go the road of kufr. And in fact, one has to do hijrat, move away from them physically, set up a new community, and then do jihad against them and fight against them. And although some of them, when they were defeated, especially the Najdiya, when they were defeated, then they altered these doctrines and watered them down and said, no, we don't have to do hijrat and we don't have to do jihad anymore. But they continue to maintain their points of view on Islamic history as such. So merit is the only criteria. Slaves and women were unfortunately excluded, although there was a sect that also said women should also. And by the way, amongst the Kharijis, the women would also fight physically. They were warrior women, etc. And these were very, very, you can imagine as I'm painting them, very, very tough people who really come from the rural areas, etc. They were fanatical in their devotion. They could kill, they could die, they could do everything, etc. Made really, really good fighters. But they were very, very narrow-minded as well at a certain level, that they considered nobody else to be Muslim except themselves. They were also very good with respect to the non-Arabs. They considered that anybody who embraces Islam should have the same status. Now it's very important to understand this because Umayyads did not think that way. Umayyads felt that Islam is the religion of the Arabs. And the state that the Umayyads set up was a state in which the Arabs and the Ajmis, the Arabi and the Ajmi, did not have equal rights. The rights of the Ajmi, that is the Persians, the word Ajmi itself means to be mute, to not be able to speak. They could speak, but they couldn't speak Arabic. They would speak Persian. So they were called Ajmis by the Arabs. So the rule was that they had to become clients. They had to serve, they had to become servants of Arab tribes in order for them to have any political or social rights, etc. So the Kharijis were the exception to that. They said, no, everybody who embraces Islam is equal. That's it. Regardless of ethnicity, regardless of the language they speak, that's irrelevant. All the imams of the Sufris and the Ibadis in North Africa from 740 onwards were in fact non-Arab. So it wasn't just that they said it, they meant it. And they obviously rejected hereditary succession. They said, doesn't matter, father to son, Khilafat cannot go father to son, Imamat cannot go from father to son. That is totally wrong. It has to be based only on merit. So they fused Islam with the egalitarian spirit of the Arab tribesmen, and especially of the nomads. Their vision was anti-authoritarian in the sense that they didn't give complete and absolute power to the imam, etc. And that is why modern political scientists often refer to them as democratic, sometimes as anarchist, but sometimes as democratic, anarchist, egalitarian, but in the tribal way, not in the modern way at all. The imam represented God, not the people as such, but God represented his will through the scholars who chose the imam. So there is no separation of power that way. But the problem, of course, is that they also did not have a formula for ruling now what was a very complex, large society. They could have their imams, but they could only create small communities because they wanted to replicate the model, the original model of the Medinan state, exactly in the way that the Prophet lived, including how they lived in their personal lives without riches and in poverty and so on. But of course, that could be only sustainable in small communities, not in large ones. They also began to change some of their doctrines. They denied that imamate had ever existed. They took as their starting point the widely accepted view that an imam was someone on whom everybody agreed. And they said, since nobody can agree on anybody anymore, so therefore this whole thing is now up for debate and discussion, etc. There can be no unanimous decision on that. As I already told you, the Najdiya, of course, changed their views a lot. So they even said that after a certain while that you don't even have to have an imam. Just live by the book and that will be fine. And if you didn't have an imam, then you didn't have to do jihad. You didn't have to do hijrat and you didn't have to do jihad. So you could live under now any political authority. So slowly they de-radicalized, but it took hundreds of years for that to happen.